In the spring of 1453, one of the most strategically significant cities in the known world had been standing for over 1,000 years. It had survived sieges, plagues, internal coups, and the slow erosion of the empire it once commanded. Its walls, constructed across multiple centuries and reinforced by generations of engineers, had repelled attackers that many considered unstoppable. And yet, by the final days of May in that year, those walls were being tested in a way they had never been before, not simply by a larger army, but by a fundamentally different kind of warfare. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, sat at the intersection of Europe and Asia Minor, controlling the narrow strait that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Its geographic position had made it wealthy, politically consequential, and militarily coveted for centuries. Contemporary records indicate that by the mid-15th century, however, the city that had once administered a vast and powerful empire now governed little more than its own urban boundaries and a handful of surrounding territories. The empire had contracted dramatically. What remained was largely a city-state, still carrying the institutional memory and symbolic weight of something far larger than what it had become. If you find value in careful, evidence-based examinations of the pivotal moments that shaped the medieval and early modern world, consider subscribing to History in Depth, where each episode is built around primary sources and historical scholarship, rather than myth or simplification. 2. Understand why Constantinople fell when it did, and why it had managed to survive for so long before that. It is necessary to understand both the internal condition of the Byzantine state and the external pressures that had been building for well over a generation. The Ottoman Empire, under the leadership of Sultan Mehmed II, who had come to power for the second time in 1451, had made the capture of the city a clear administrative and military priority. Historical evidence suggests that Mehmed began detailed preparations almost immediately after consolidating his position, commissioning fortifications along the Bosphorus and consulting military engineers about siege capabilities that exceeded anything his predecessors had deployed. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, who had assumed the throne in 1449, inherited a state that was fiscally exhausted, politically fragmented, and largely abandoned by the Western Christian powers that Byzantine diplomats had spent decades petitioning for meaningful military support. Primary sources from the period describe repeated embassies to Rome and to the courts of Western Europe, each returning with promises that rarely translated into soldiers or ships in sufficient numbers. The city's population had declined substantially from its medieval peak. Administrative documents reveal that some neighborhoods within the walls had become largely depopulated, with agricultural land occupying areas that had once been dense urban settlement. What was about to unfold was not simply a military confrontation between two armies. It was the resolution of a structural imbalance that had been developing for over a century between an empire in sustained decline and a state in rapid and organized expansion. The Byzantine Empire that faced its final siege in 1453 was, in institutional terms, a shadow of the administrative structure that had once governed territories stretching across southeastern Europe, Anatolia, the Levant, and North Africa. Understanding the political condition of Constantinople at this moment requires tracing the gradual erosion of economic contraction and the compounding effects of internal succession disputes. The Byzantine system of governance had historically been centralized around the imperial court in Constantinople, with provincial administration managed through a network of appointed officials, military commanders, and regional ecclesiastical authorities. By the 15th century, that network had largely ceased to function in any meaningful territorial sense. Scholarly consensus places the effective Byzantine-controlled territory at the time of the siege as consisting primarily of Constantinople itself, the despotate of the Morea in the southern Peloponnese, and a small number of Aegean islands. The elaborate machinery of imperial administration that had once processed tax revenues, managed grain supply chains, and coordinated military mobilization across a wide geography now operated within a dramatically reduced perimeter. The financial condition of the imperial government was correspondingly constrained. Contemporary records indicate that the treasury had been under sustained pressure since at least the mid-14th century, when the Black Death disrupted trade networks and reduced the taxable population significantly. The Italian merchant republics of Venice and Genoa had long maintained privileged trading rights within Byzantine territory, agreements that had originally been negotiated in exchange for naval and military assistance, but which, over time, had transferred substantial commercial revenue away from Byzantine control. By the time Constantine XI was attempting to organize the city's defenses in the early 1450s, administrative documents reveal that the imperial government was struggling to fund even basic garrison operations without relying on private contributions from wealthy citizens and the Orthodox Church. The political relationship between the Byzantine court and the Western Christian world had also reached a point of practical exhaustion. The Council of Florence in 1439 had produced a formal declaration of union between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, an agreement that Byzantine leadership had pursued primarily as a mechanism for securing Western military intervention. Primary sources from the period describe the reception of this union within Constantinople as deeply divisive. A significant portion of the Orthodox clergy and lay population rejected the arrangement on theological grounds, and the political capital spent in negotiating it yielded far less military support than its architects had anticipated. When a small contingent of papal troops and a modest Venetian naval force eventually arrived, they represented a fraction of what Byzantine diplomats had sought. Within the walls of Constantinople in the decades preceding the siege, daily life had been shaped by the same forces of contraction that had diminished the empire's political and military reach. The city that had once been among the largest and most commercially active urban centers in the medieval world had, by the mid-15th century, become a quieter and in many respects diminished version of its former self. Understanding the texture of ordinary life in this period helps clarify both the resilience the city demonstrated during the siege and the limitations it could not overcome. At its height, Constantinople had supported a population that historians estimate at several 100,000 residents. By 1453, scholarly consensus places the city's population at somewhere between 40 and 70,000 people, a figure reflecting centuries of plague, emigration, economic contraction, and the general instability that had made the city a less viable center of commerce and opportunity than it had once been. Primary sources from the period describe distinct neighborhoods within the walls that had effectively become villages, separated by open land that had reverted to gardens or, in some cases, small-scale agriculture. The physical scale of the city's infrastructure, its aqueducts, forums, and public buildings remained visible as evidence of a larger past. Though many structures had fallen into disrepair or been repurposed, the economy of the city in its final decades operated largely through the commercial activity of foreign merchant communities, particularly the Genoese colony established across the Golden Horn in the district of Galata. Contemporary records indicate that Genoese merchants controlled a disproportionate share of the trade passing through the strait, conducting business under treaty arrangements that exempted them from many of the taxes and restrictions applied to Byzantine subjects. Venetian merchants maintained a similarly privileged position, and the presence of these competing Italian communities within and immediately adjacent to Constantinople created a commercial environment in which Byzantine economic interests were frequently secondary to those of their nominal allies. For the Greek Orthodox population that formed the core of the city's permanent residence, daily life was organized substantially around the structures of the church. The Orthodox ecclesiastical network maintained hospitals, charitable institutions, and educational functions that the weakened imperial administration could no longer fully support. Administrative documents reveal that monastic communities within the city controlled significant land holdings and operated as economic units in their own right, providing employment, food distribution, and social organization for surrounding neighborhoods. The church was not simply a religious institution. In this context, it was one of the primary functioning administrative bodies remaining in the city. The garrison defending Constantinople in the spring of 1453 reflected the human resources available to the imperial government. Historical evidence suggests that the total number of defenders, including Byzantine soldiers. The Ottoman Siege of Constantinople began in earnest in early April of 1453, when Mehmed II positioned his forces along the land walls that stretched across the western side of the peninsula on which the city sat. The scale of the operation was considerable by any measure of the period. Contemporary records indicate that the Ottoman army numbered in the tens of thousands, supported by a naval fleet tasked with controlling the waters surrounding the city and preventing the resupply of defenders by sea. The combination of land and naval pressure was deliberate and coordinated, reflecting the level of strategic planning that had preceded the campaign. The most consequential technological element of the siege was the deployment of large-caliber artillery against the Theodosian walls, the layered, defensive fortification that had protected the city's landward approach since the 5th century. Mehmed had commissioned the construction of several exceptionally large cannons prior to the campaign, including a piece designed by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, whose earlier offer of service had been declined by the Byzantine court due to insufficient funds. Primary sources from the period describe the psychological as well as physical impact of these weapons, noting that the sound of the largest cannon could be heard at considerable distance, and that the vibrations from repeated fire were felt throughout the city. The walls, though thick and well constructed, had not been designed to absorb this kind of sustained artillery bombardment, and sections of the outer fortifications began to sustain damage that repair crews working through the night struggled to adequately address. The Byzantine and Genoese defenders responded with organization and determination. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese commander who had arrived with a small but experienced force of soldiers, took effective operational control of the land wall defenses and coordinated repair efforts alongside military resistance. Historical evidence suggests that the defenders successfully repelled multiple direct assault attempts during the first weeks of the siege, exploiting their knowledge of the wall's structure and the natural advantages of defending prepared positions. The Ottoman fleet, meanwhile, was initially prevented from entering the Golden Horn, the inlet forming the city's northern boundary, by a large chain stretched across its entrance, a defensive measure that had been used effectively in previous sieges. In late April, Mehmed ordered a logistical maneuver that significantly altered the naval situation. Ottoman forces transported a portion of their fleet overland, using a constructed pathway of greased timber to move ships from the Bosphorus into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain entirely. Contemporary accounts describe the impact of this development on the morale of the city's defenders, as it opened the northern shoreline to Ottoman naval pressure and stretched the already thin defensive garrison across an additional perimeter. A subsequent attempt by Byzantine and allied vessels to disrupt the newly positioned Ottoman fleet was repelled. By mid-May, the cumulative effect of sustained artillery fire had created significant breaches and weaknesses in the land walls. The fall of Constantinople on the 29th of May, 1453, carried consequences that extended well beyond the immediate military outcome. The event marked the end of a political and institutional continuity that had persisted in various forms for nearly 11 centuries from the founding of the city by the Roman Emperor Constantine I in 330 CE to its capture by Ottoman forces under Mehmed II. Evaluating its long-term significance requires separating the immediate material consequences from the broader historical processes it either accelerated or symbolically concluded. In the immediate aftermath, Mehmed II entered the city and took steps to establish Ottoman administrative control with relative speed. Contemporary records indicate that he moved to limit the period of uncontrolled looting to a defined time frame, consistent with the conventions of siege warfare recognized in the period, and then issued orders intended to stabilize the city as a functioning urban center. Mehmed had clear intentions for Constantinople as a capital. Historical evidence suggests he understood the symbolic and administrative value of the city and actively worked to repopulate it by encouraging the settlement of Muslim Christian, and Jewish communities within its boundaries. The Hagia Sophia, the great church that had stood at the center of Orthodox Christian life for nearly 1,000 years, was converted into a mosque. The Orthodox Patriarchate, however, was permitted to continue functioning under Ottoman authority, with Gennadius Silurius appointed as Patriarch, a decision that reflected Mehmed's pragmatic approach to governing a religiously diverse population. For the Byzantine diaspora, the fall of the city accelerated a movement of scholars, manuscripts, and intellectual traditions into Western Europe that had been underway for several decades prior to 1453. Primary sources from the period document the arrival of Greek-speaking scholars in Italian cities, particularly Florence and Venice, bringing with them texts and knowledge of classical Greek that contributed to the scholarly environment associated with the Renaissance. Scholarly consensus is careful to note that this migration was not the singular cause of renewed European interest in classical antiquity. That process had deeper and more complex roots, but the events of 1453 did intensify and concentrate a transfer of intellectual resources that had measurable effects on European learning. The fall also had significant consequences for the commercial geography of the Eastern Mediterranean and the overland trade routes connecting Europe to Asian markets. Ottoman control of Constantinople gave the empire command over the strait linking the Black Sea to the Aegean, consolidating a strategic and economic position of considerable importance. Contemporary records indicate that the disruption to established Phoenician and Genoese trading arrangements accelerated European interest in finding alternative maritime routes to Asian markets, a reorientation of commercial ambition that would, within decades, contribute to the conditions that produced the voyages of exploration along the African coast and eventually across the Atlantic. Within the Islamic world, the conquest carried substantial symbolic weight. Mehmed II was recognized across Muslim-majority regions as having accomplished something that generations of rulers before him had attempted without success. Administrative documents and literary sources from the period reflect the degree to which the capture of Constantinople elevated Ottoman prestige and reinforced the empire's position as the dominant power in the region. The city, renamed Constantine in Ottoman usage, became the administrative and cultural capital of an empire that would continue expanding for another century. What the fall of Constantinople ultimately represents in historical terms is not a single catastrophic rupture, but rather the formal conclusion of a long structural transition. The Byzantine Empire had been contracting for over a century before the final siege. The Ottoman Empire had been expanding with consistent momentum across the same period. The events of 1453 resolved that transition in definitive terms, closing one chapter of Mediterranean and European history while opening conditions that would shape the next. The walls that had stood for 1,000 years did not simply fall to a larger army. They fell at the intersection of institutional decline, technological change, and the consolidated momentum of a state that had organized itself over generations for precisely this moment.